You go work and down the path alongside the lake. A tender-hearted woman saw a poor half-frozen snake. His pretty colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. Oh, well, she cried, I'll take you in and I'll take care of you. Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, tender woman. The snake. She wrapped him up all cozy in a coverture of silk, and then laid him by the fireside with some honey and some milk. Now she hurried home from her work that night. As soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, tender woman. The snake. She clutched him to her bosom. You're so beautiful, she cried. But if I hadn't have brought you in, by now you might have died. Now she stroked his pretty skin again and then kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thanks, that snake gave her a vicious bite. Take me in, oh.
Hello, good morning from New York, where it's really cold today. I'm really happy to welcome all of you to this amazing event with Alex Hinton. I want to introduce our different speakers, but before I do, I want to say I've known Alex for 20 years. We met actually at the International Association of Genocide Scholars. We were the only anthropologists there. I work in Guatemala. Alex, of course, works in Cambodia and the US and other places as well. But we had this conversation at the International Association of Genocide Scholars in Minnesota in 2001. And the conversation was, why aren't there more anthropologists doing research on genocide? And why aren't there more anthropologists here at this association meeting? And why isn't there more study on genocides around the world? And as any of you who have looked up Alex's trajectory know, over the course of the past 2 decades, he has corrected that. He won an award for anticipatory anthropology from the American Anthropological Association with his first book about the Cambodian genocide. He's continued to do work not only on the Cambodian genocide, but to help all of us who work on pressing issues of human rights and genocide problematize and think about what our role is as scholars and why our work matters in the larger world. It's been my honor to know Alex over these decades, and I just wanted to share that with you. He's an excellent friend and colleague, and I'm just so delighted to be moderating this event today. I don't want to take up a lot of time. I'm professor of anthropology at Lehman College in the Graduate Center, City University of New York. I'm the founding director of the Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies, and Alex and I have done a lot of work together. He is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. He's a UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention. He's written over a dozen books, so I'm not going to spend 30 minutes giving brief summaries because then he won't have time to talk. But I will just say that his work, without his work, we wouldn't be able to have a lot of the conversations that we have today. And in addition to his groundbreaking, path-breaking, individually authored books, he has also made a commitment to support junior scholars, not just in the United States, but around the world, including people from Cambodia, from Latin America, from Europe, from Africa, from other places in the world, so that everyone's voice is heard on these pressing issues. And he's made it possible for a lot of young people to move their careers along on topics that weren't really considered quote unquote scholarly 20 years ago. So thank you, Alex. The book, of course, that we will be looking at and hearing about today is It Can Happen Here, which if you don't have it, it is a beautiful book. And it's about white power and the rising threat of genocide in the US. I had the honor of reading this when it was in process, and I'm not going to make a lot of comments about it here now. I just want to moderate this panel. I also want to introduce Alfred. I don't know if Alfred is here yet, Frankowski, who is specializes in critical philosophy of race, African American and Africana philosophy, and also Cathy Schlund-Vials, who is a professor of English and Asian American Studies. They're going to be discussants today after Alex presents his book. If you have questions for Alex or for Cathy or for Al as we're moving through our program, please put those questions in the chat, and I will be keeping track of the questions. And when we get to the end of the presenters talking, we'll come back and I'll raise those questions with the people you've asked them of. So without further ado, Alex, we turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Wow, what an introduction. You know, what I'm particularly delighted about is to have participants who have, you know, been so influential in the field, but also impacted my work. And I should just say, you know, this is a bit of a digression, but not too much. The original, remember that original project that we all began with way back when, right? We all have that project. Sometimes they disappear, sometimes they go in weird directions. My original project actually was a conversation between my work in Cambodia, that's still there in this book, and what was going on in the US. And I actually had it set up going through my testimony at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And there are a lot of twists and turns and different things. And along the way, for example, Victoria and Cathy helped me formulate the project. And then that project became 2 books. So there's actually a second book called Anthropological Witness, Lessons from the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, that's coming out next year, that really is in conversation with this book. But that's just a little, you know, one small example of some of the conversations, you know, I've had with everybody who's participating in the panel, as well as some of the people who are here. So to begin, I just wanted to, you know, sort of note the music. What's the music? The music was Al Wilson's The Snake. For any of those who've cracked open the book, you'll recognize the first chapter. And that actually is where I want to begin. I should note that Al is having some trouble. He had one of those Zoom update things, and the Zoom update has created further problems. So he'll be joining us. It could be by phone in the end, but he is trying to, anyways, to join us. So he'll be here soon. I'm going to, I think I have about 15 or 20 minutes to go on. So I'm going to begin by reading an excerpt. I'm going to end by reading an excerpt from the book to give you a sense for it. You know, the book, you know, we're trained, many of us, to write in a certain sort of way, expository prose, often, at least it used to be, especially in anthropology, a sort of authority, ethnographic authority. You know, a lot of that's been decentered, and in anthropology and other disciplines, there's a little more experimental writing going on, and this book fits into that tradition as well. It's purposely written in a different sort of way to not just tell, but to show, to do both, and to use setting, place, and that really, I want to give you a sense for that, and also to sort of situate you at the start of the book. So this, and I've got a little in the middle of it, it's not much of a surprise, but a tiny surprise. So I'm going to start my timer and begin. So this is the very first page and a half of the book. Introduction, The Snake, March 14th, 2016, Vienna, Ohio. I want to read you something. Presidential candidate Donald Trump stands before a raucous audience at a campaign rally at the Youngstown Airport in Vienna, Ohio. It is March 14th, 2016, the day before the state's Republican primary. Trump had arrived on his personal jet featuring gold-plated seatbelts and Rolls-Royce engines. It is painted red, white, and blue and emblazoned with Trump's name, which is also printed in thick, bold letters on each of the ramp stairs he descended before walking to the nearby podium, while the crowd cheered and recorded his entrance on their phones. Some hold "Make America Great Again" signs. Trump invokes the slogan several times during his Vienna stump speech, homing in on the country's alleged dismal state of affairs: job losses, bad deals, manufacturing decline, and decrepit infrastructure. We're becoming third world, Trump laments. The solution is to vote him into office. We're going to do the things the country isn't used to doing, Trump explains. It's called, we're going to win. To underscore the point, Trump offers a story. I want to read you this because I love it, Trump tells the crowd. The story, he continues, is based on a 1968 song by Al Wilson, an African-American soul singer, who all of you just heard. It's called "The Snake," Trump tells the crowd. He underscores his disgust by wrinkling his nose and saying, "Ooh, the snake." Reading from a sheet, Trump begins.
About terror, and we talk about terrorism. And we talk about, remember this is for what I'm going to read. We talk about the wrong people coming into our country, right? And we can't allow it. And I love you. Look at this crowd. I love you. I mean, it's amazing. Okay, are you ready? And this is called the snake. A snake, oh, snake, right? On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. Her pretty colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. "Oh, well," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you. Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed the broken snake. She wrapped him up all cozy in a curvature of silk, and then laid him by the fireside with honey and some milk. Now she hurried home from work that night. As soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. She was happy. "Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed the broken snake. Now she clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried. "But if I hadn't brought you in by now, heavens, you might have died." Now she stroked his pretty skin, and then she kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite. "Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman," sighed that vicious snake. "I saved you," cried the woman, "and you've bit me. Heavens, why? You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die." "Oh, shut up, silly woman," said the reptile with a grin. "You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in." Right? Right? You.
Okay, that may bring back some memories for some. Anyways, so that was the text. So I'm going to jump back into another paragraph or two of the book. So it's not the first time Trump has related this parable, which is becoming a staple at his campaign rallies. The snake speaks to the heart of his campaign message. The dangerous, malicious outsiders symbolized by the vicious snake, posed to the US, represented by the quote unquote tender-hearted woman who takes it in, Usually, as is the case in Vienna, Trump precedes the parable by warning his audience about the dangers posed by terrorists, immigrants, and other threatening non-white others. This language of borders, dangerous outsiders, and a nation besieged is familiar to me. My research focuses on genocide and mass violence. Indeed, on the day of Trump's Vienna campaign speech, I was on the other side of the world testifying on precisely these issues at an international tribunal where the Khmer Rouge committed a genocide from 1975 to 1979. If Trump had the snake, the Khmer Rouge had the crocodile, an imagined enemy invader threatening the revolutionary body politic. Such connections between the past and the present are a central plank of this book, which argues that the danger of genocide and atrocity crimes in the US looms much larger than most people realize. Okay, so I am going to jump into a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so again, I just want to reiterate my thanks to our fantastic commentators and moderator, as well as to Tim and Suzanne for organizing the series. And I refer you to many of the other books that have been reviewed. All of them are recorded and online. And I think a few of the people who are also on this, who are with us today, have also had books that have been, that have had launches in the series. So as you could tell from that, what are my goals in writing the book? It's to mobilize some different literary strategies, and have the setting, have voice, journey, a lot of it set in the classroom. And I'm going to conclude with a very brief segment that's in the classroom. So we begin with the snake, and it's sort of, the book opens partly in Charlottesville, but sort of with this broader question of how is Trump mobilizing, energizing so many different people, beginning with Charlottesville, but also a series of far-right extremist attacks that took place afterward, and culminating with the 1/6 Capitol insurrection, which I only touch on in the preface to the book, because the book actually had been finished in July 2020, but I was able to get something in, sort of linking it back in the preface. But if it's, it sort of comes straight out of what I was talking about in the book. Again, these are just some of the many attacks that took place while Trump was in office, and he was inciting people. And as many of you know, including those who are not in the country, Trump remains a presence. The thing we're all waiting for is for him to get social media back. He has a new network. And once that happens, I think we're in for it again. So we, already there are many, maybe we can talk about in the Q&A if anybody has questions. There's massive polarization and things are still quite unstable. So anyways, the book, remains directly linked into things that are going on what's now, but it sort of runs from Charlottesville to the Capitol insurrection. And really Charlottesville was a key moment for me in writing it, because, when in Charlottesville, when you had the Unite the Right rally, the far-right extremists who went there yelled things famously like blood and soil, you or Jews will not replace us, which to those of us who study these issues are very familiar. And so it was really at Charlottesville, I had been thinking about writing the book, but when it got to Charlottesville, that was the moment I said, okay, I'm going to do something more substantial. Again, at that point, though, it was maybe going to be this dialogue between Cambodia and my testimony and what was going on in the US. So one of the sort of the question, that I had studied, and I'm again framing this talk because there are many different aspects to the book, but perpetration is certainly one of them. And one of the links between the Cambodia research and this research, obviously, is the question of perpetrator motivation, how genocide and mass violence come to take place. I'm not going to talk about the latter part of the book where I sort of take up the issue of can it happen here using genocide prevention tools, of different sorts and different forms of analysis, but that's there. But really, there's this guy, Tony Hoveder, who was a member of the Traditionalist Workers' Party, a neo-Nazi group who was profiled in the Times. And the reporter, Richard Fawcett, wanted to know, what motivated him to go to Charlottesville. He seemed, so ordinary, so to speak. And he ended a second piece he wrote on the article with the question, what makes a man starts fire, which comes from a punk rock album you can see on the screen there to the side. And so that became a question that I'm going to return to at the end. That was one of the drivers of trying to unpack what was motivating many far-right extremists to threaten and actually, engage in violent attacks, and also what was it about Trump that synergized with them, that motivated them. So one of the big motifs of the book is lessons motif. As I said, parts of it are set in the classroom. Moral compass is a big issue in the backdrop. People always talk about moral compass. And in the end of the book, I take that up. The notion of drawing on lessons of the past, everyone always talks about that. Well, what does that mean exactly? But also in terms of today, I want to focus, even though it's not the central pillar of the book, but it's a theme on a little bit on Adorno and his famous essay, Education After Auschwitz, the demand that Auschwitz not happen again. So in keeping with this, I want to present, there's the boulder with Adorno. As I'm sure most of you are aware, in this essay, Education After Auschwitz, he talked about the need to know the mechanisms that lead to mass atrocities. He was coming from it from his own Frankfurt School perspective, even as he also worked with US positivist psychologists to produce the authoritarian personality. That's sort of a separate story. But in all of this, what he was working against was the need, the space. He sort of didn't have faith in any sort of revolution in the Marxist-Leninist sense. And so he turned to education and the notion of developing critical self-reflection. And so I want to talk a little bit today in the time that's remaining about reified consciousness, which he speaks about as being blinded to the historical past, to not understanding how you occupy a space and the different forces that inform it, that what is presented as absolute is contingent. And again, going back to critical self-reflection, critical self-consciousness, the need to rupture these different coercive mechanisms. So just a very small example of that, that I talk about in the book, though I don't frame it quite in these terms. But in thinking about, go back to Hoveder, what motivates them, there's the sort of bad apples explanation often appears. And there's that notion, it's not me, it's those haters over there that do it. It has nothing to do with me. Or, as we often get, we got after 1/6, not us, right? This isn't the US, this is not who we are. And then we also in the backdrop, in terms of sort of engaging with the possibility that genocide and atrocity crimes can take place in the US, and the book talks about how they have taken place repeatedly in the US. We have the motif of, not that. It's not the Holocaust, it's not that. So again, these are different ways of thinking that blind people to the potentiality of not just that mass violence could take place, but that it has repeatedly taken place. And it's been interesting, since I began writing the book, the conversation has completely shifted, and people are talking about this much more than when I first began in the US. So again, part of that's, not looking at Trump as an exception, at Charlottesville or 1/6 as an exception, but seeing them as a symptom. And again, part of this, in keeping with the, the Adorno quote, is, frameworks that focus on the hater, so to speak, individualize, and they put the attention on agency, which is an important factor, but it therefore erases structure. And just a couple of examples, we talk about racist as opposed to structural racism. And I just want to put the caveat that prior to George Floyd, structural racism was not a mainstream topic in the US. So when I was writing most of the book, even though academics talked about it, of course, to talk about not hate, but hate as a discourse. And again, this ties into the functionalist intentionalist debate, so on and so forth, but to foreground structure. So, what is he talking about in terms of reified consciousness? That which is naturalized, dehistoricized, reductive thinking, but especially structured by power, decontextualized and mechanical thinking. And, by this, he talked about sometimes ticketed thinking. And one example he once gave is someone once said to him, "Are you an introvert or an extrovert?" And so that was the idea of the vast complexity of an individual truncated and reduced to a very stereotype way of thinking, looking at other people. He talked about the veil of technology, which was social media in terms of structure by power, is something that obviously is very important and brings back essays like the culture industry, right, to sort of recast them in terms of social media. They have a new resonance. Anyway, so in terms of this type of thinking, ticket thinking, Jews will not replace us, blood and soil, you will not replace us. The book talks about the flash, line, and hammer as one sort of framework for thinking about far-right extremism and radicalization, and in keeping with the authoritarian personality argument, which is that a very substantial number of people in the US and the tens of millions are sympathetic to these views. And I think that's pretty clear. That statistic has repeatedly recurred. Often you get 8 to 12% of the US population. But they suggested, in terms of sympathies, even more. But we're talking about, 20, 30 million people in the US are sympathetic to this perspective. And again, I think when I began this project, this might have been surprising. Now it's less surprising, perhaps. One of the links to my work in Cambodia is sort of taking the notion of the Khmer Rouge political line, the party line, and using it to think about structure in terms of politics, organization, consciousness, and context. And so I don't have time. I'm a little bit behind where I wanted to be. So I was going to take you through this framework, reworking it to think about in terms of producing identity and difference through thick frames of power, which is a term I talk about in Manner Monster. But for example, looking at Nazi Germany, right, and the production of identity, looking at the United States in terms of racial classifications, which ties into debates about structural racism. But again, so moving back to the sort of ticket thinking, reified consciousness, and the things that were said at Charlottesville, if you begin to unpack it, you don't have to look very far because, it's on all the posters and literature. This stuff is not hidden. But again, blood and soil, direct reference to Nazi Germany, and the alt-right who burst into the foreground at Charlottesville. So what was their platform? They came out with their own manifesto and they said demography is destiny. Those anthropologists are really bad people because they say that race is socially constructed. They say the Jewish question is valid, and they say white genocide's underway. So in terms of, this is one strand of the book, but in terms of going back to Hoveder and his What Makes a Man Start Fires, I have a chapter on white genocide. And the 14 words with the 1488 code, 14 for 14 words, 88 for Heil Hitler. We must secure the existence of our peoples and a future for white children. Jews are often posited within this imaginary as the force of evil that are manipulating Black and brown people and attempting to eradicate the white race. So again, in terms of thinking of this white genocide frame, in terms of a larger social movement, white power, social movement that we have in the US and all over many parts of the world at this point. I want to sort of return with that 14 words to an interview that Hoveder did on a Nordic Frontier podcast in Sweden. And he said, white people should have an ethno-state. A Future for Our White Children. So there you see him directly invoking the 14 words. At Charlottesville, a neo-Nazi from the Daily Stormer. All of you will know the reference, why they titled that for their website platform. You can read through this. And again, it's like, we're going to have enough power. We're going to clear them from the streets. That which is degenerate in white countries will be removed. This is our country. But again, with Hoveter in his interview, white people having an ethno-state, a future for our white children. So if we go back and return to where I began with Trump and the snake, you can directly read the snake as a white genocide parable. So Trump himself is directly mobilizing, right, his discourse. Besides a lot of different racist dog whistles, he explicitly is encoding white genocide into his campaign oratory to inflame grievance and the sense of white genocide. And again, I've mentioned the authoritarian personality, but what I want to finish up with in the like literally 1 minute that's left is just to go back to the classroom where part of the book is set. And again, like one of my students read the early version and said, oh, it's like being in a classroom, and that's what I'm aiming for. There's a chapter on Charlottesville and a teach-in. And again, going back to Adorno, denaturalized, rehistoricized. Part of this in teaching is to historicize and explain, as opposed to these racist haters, who exactly is involved, the different groups, what their ideology is, what the history is, and the connection to the past. So one chapter is focused on a Charlottesville teach-in that I taught that takes this up, but I also have a chapter on the hater, and that's where I want to end and read a little bit about it. So I asked my students while I was teaching to take up Hoveter's question, quote unquote, what makes a man start fires, for their final essays. And so I'm just going to finish by reading a few paragraphs at the end of the book. April 24th, 2018, Rutgers University, Newark, New Jersey. On the last day of class, my students present Pecha Kuchas, a 6-minute, 40-second format originated by architects, which involves presenting 20 slides advancing on a 20-second timer on the perpetrators they've been studying all semester. We dim the lights. Quote unquote, the hater appears on the screen. Hitler, Stalin, Castro, Pinochet, even Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Drawing on the course readings, each student gives their answer to Fawcett's question, what makes a man start fires? Then we reach the last presentation of the class. A student takes the podium. She shouts, there's an elephant in the room. A large elephant crammed in a tiny green room appears on the screen. The student pauses for effect, then says, American genocide. Her next slide is an animated map showing European colonial expansion since 1450. The screen rapidly fills with dots covering most of the globe. A statue of Columbus, hands blood red, appears next. Her hater is Captain John Underhill. She tells about his role in the early Pequot War, a Massachusetts Bay genocide, one of the first among many quote unquote American fires, this one taking place before there was even a USA. Professors asked us a trick question, she announces, then allows a long pause. The image of a man breathing fire appears on the screen. What makes a man set fire, she says, then falls silent, her words hanging in the air. The question's a misdirection, she suddenly exclaims. It focuses attention on the actions of a single individual. We need to account for structure. The student goes on to look at the preconditions of the Pequot genocide and the sparks that set the conflict aflame: ethnocentrism, dehumanization, social structure, and the longer history of settler colonialism that laid the preconditions for the Pequot War. The hater. Interrogate the question. A lesson learned in Trump's USA.
Wow, thank you so much, Alex. I think that everyone's profoundly moved by this amazing presentation of your book. And again, Just as you mentioned at the beginning, that your preface looks at the insurrection because your book was completed. It truly is anticipatory and extraordinarily important. I also do want to mention, I forgot to introduce the Perpetrator Studies Network at the beginning, which is sponsoring this, organized by Timothy Williams and Suzanne Kittle. The Perpetrator Studies Network is an international and interdisciplinary network of scholars and educators whose research and teaching centers on perpetrators and perpetration of genocide, mass killings, and political violence. It provides a forum for scholarly discussions about and innovative research into perpetration across historical, geographic, and cultural lines. So it's really wonderful to have this network and this rich discussion that we're anticipating. We have two commentators today. We have Cathy Schlund-Vials. I'm sure I've just massacred your name. I'm so sorry. And she's been the director of Asian and Asian American Studies at UConn since 2010. She's also currently the president of the National Association of Asian American Studies. And Al Frankowski, who just got over a similar Zoom situation that I had last week, where I had to update my Zoom system in order to join a conversation. I'm really happy that you were able to get through it because it's super frustrating. You're like, come on, come on, come on. So glad to have you here. He is associate professor and director of graduate studies. He specializes in critical philosophy of race, African American and Africana philosophy, aesthetics, postcolonialism, and critical genocide studies. He's published broadly, as has Cathy. So I'm really delighted to have both of you. I'm not sure who's going first. Who wants to be first? Cathy, Alfred, who would like to go? Alfred raised your hand, so it could be you. You can go first then, please. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for setting this up and for making this happen. This is a really wonderful book, and you know, unfortunately, when you're doing genocide studies, you start writing, you start down a path of sort of careful scholarly questions, and you're sort of pulled in two directions. On the one hand, you hope by the end of your book that your book is still relevant, but you also fear that it may be even more relevant afterwards, and that takes up a different commentary on the state of the world, right? Definitely, that's the case with Alexander Hinton's book. It Can Happen Here. As Hinton talks about through his journey in the book with his students, I think that we all kind of started the Trump presidency with shock and fear, and I know that was definitely the case with me and my students. I recall when I was reading the book, this actually got me to recall the feeling of going back onto campus and going into the classroom the day after the election. And the first thing I recalled was that I was stuck in my own head thinking about, now, how am I going to talk about existentialism at this moment? What state are my students going to be in? And then I noticed when I walked around campus how quiet the campus was, and how many groups of people were huddled together and literally hugging each other. So there was something about that moment that just really brought home that this is a sort of shock and awe moment. And I remember telling my students at some point something to the effect of, the struggles that we're up against have not changed. They've just become more difficult. And I get the sense that I probably needed to tell my students that because I needed to tell myself that. And but what's sort of become realized, I think, over the last few years is that the struggles themselves haven't changed all that much, and yet it's really important to understand how difficult they have been. And I think that Hinton's book really does allow us to grapple with that duality, that it seems like there's something new. It seems like the Trump administration and the rise of white supremacist movements is something new, but it's also something the same, and it's something that's increasingly difficult to deal with. I wanted to pitch my commentary sort of within those three themes, and I wanted to follow up on how Hinton was using Adorno to frame a lot of this, even though I don't mention Adorno explicitly in this. So I'll apologize right from the start that I'm going to read through my commentary. Hopefully, it won't be alienating. So Hinton's book is framed within the rising visibility of the organized activities of white supremacist groups that have marked much of the 21st century in surprising ways. It Can Happen Here not only shows how these were made more visible through the Trump administration, it challenges us to think more carefully about what these rising movements mean socially and politically. I want to focus my commentary on how to think this meaning with the suggestions of this text. In addition, I want to say how much I appreciate Dr. Hinton's focus on the text and analysis of the We Charge Genocide petition and his use of this text within the critical frameworks of education and critical theory, both of which I want to use as a way of motivating questions about white supremacy and genocide that is at hand, even when it feels far away. One of the general questions that It Can Happen Here emphasizes is the role of genocide as essential to education and critique. Critique, as Hinton says, is about emancipation. Part of why this is important is because the illustrations of classroom discussions shifts from the normal sense of how we think of white supremacist violence to an interrogation of frameworks, resources, narratives, and histories, to a question of what role our initial assumptions play in making it harder to see their connections. None of this is more emphatically emphasized than when the students start to question genocide in the US. Hinton notes the difference in the students' language. At one point, a student asks, could it happen here? Another states plainly, it has happened here. Hinton makes use of this to explore and explode a constellation of white supremacy, tracing its roots through chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and more particularly, how these movements changed after the civil rights movement as a reaction. I think we can say that Hinton maps a genealogy of white terrorism that in its multiplicity appears as something abnormal, out of the blue, unexpected, or without reason or cause, and he shows the continual development of political activity that is at play. Whether we focus on the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville or the McVeigh bombings in Oklahoma or the shooting at Walmart, or the Garlic Festival, the framework of white supremacy is either minimized or disjointed altogether, and remain unthought as a connection or an essential factor. Yet it is this unthought.
Oh, you're back. You froze for a minute. If it keeps happening, you could maybe turn off the video and just do audio, but you're back now. So let's move forward with all of you. It's nice to see you and hear you at this point in time. Okay, thanks so much.
Take two. Would you like me to backtrack a little bit, or?
I think that maybe you probably are like a minute. We lost you for about a minute. Okay. So I'm not sure how far along you went. Maybe go back like a page, a paragraph.
Yeah, I'll go back like 3 sentences or so.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
I'll start with this point that I think goes together. So sorry if this is a repetition. I said none of this is more emphatically emphasized than when the students start to question genocide in the US. Hinton notes the difference in the students' language. At one point, a student asks, could it happen here? Another states plainly, it has happened here. Hinton makes use of this to explore and explode a constellation of white supremacy, tracing its roots through chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and more particularly how these movements changed after the civil rights movement as a reaction. I think we can say that Hinton maps a genealogy of white terrorism in its multiplicity, how it appears as something abnormal, out of the blue, unexpected, or without reason or cause. And he shows the continual development of political activity that is at play. Whether we focus on the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, or the McVeigh bombings in Oklahoma, or the shooting at Walmart, or the Garlic Festival, the framework of white supremacy is either minimized or disjointed, and yet it remains unthought as a connecting and essential factor. It is this unthoughtness as a framework that situates its politics. And thus, even the question of these acts as a part of genocide remains absent as part of its politics. I want to then focus on the strangeness of this absence. After all, Hinton reminds the reader of the greater significance of the subtle persistence of white supremacist imagery and language. It is seen in its normative distribution and how it is present as a confrontation within a system that is abnormal. Despite this, as Hinton points out, quote, millions of people in the United States hold white power views, and many more have white power sympathies. And the sense of victimization upon which the sense of which victimization upon which the white genocide frame plays, end quote. The normativity is not just one issue, but it prompts us to ask other questions. Why did the Unite the Right protest actually work, despite the fact that it failed? Hinton talks about what the organizers' aims were, and according to their aims, it seems to have failed. But I want us to ask a question in terms. I think what's at play here is to ask a question as to how did it actually work? How did it actually succeed? Why did the storming of the Capitol actually succeed as a moment of insurrection, despite also failing? I'm suspicious that something like this is at play. Like many people, I was certain that Hillary Clinton would win the 2016 election, and yet she did not, right? And there have been so many times over the last few years where I've thought that clearly failed. And yet in a broader sense, it seems to have succeeded. By looking at white supremacy as a political framework, we are challenged not only to see the illogic in the rhetoric or the lapse in the thinking that is at the base of white supremacist ideology, but also the way in which other questions are ungrounded. These events failed, but their failure confirmed a material reality to the dark dystopian fantasy land of white supremacist ideology, and provided a subtext for their urgency. They succeeded not only strategically, but politically. I want to look at this point at some of the closing lines of this text. Citing Toni Morrison, Hinton recalls that, quote, language is not neutral. It is embedded with history. And what happens when that history is not a site of collective building or articulation, but rather a burying or of a displacing even of language? What happens when the known is also what performs its own ignorance? What happens when the passiveness in language gives rise to the rotted background of historical sporadic violence? and that this passive background is also active. In relationship to this point, I want to draw Hinton's text into conversation with another author, Joy James, who wrote Resisting State Violence, I believe in 1994. Joy James writes this, quote, "Atrocities can inspire truth-telling to critique and condemn racist violence. This truth-telling, however, most often happens in eulogies at funerals or memorials. The rest of the time, we usually hear and speak the semi-illiteracy of conventional rhetoric shaping the dominant discourse on race. This semi-illiterate arises, the semi-illiteracy arises from severing racism from its logical culmination in genocide. The moral import of racism is virtually meaningless after it has been severed from genocide," end quote. At the level of discourse, our thinking and speaking is a site of severance, and even terms like white supremacy or histories of white supremacy, white violence, etc., are also marking points of being severed. The recently late philosopher Charles Mills just passed away, I think 2 months ago, similarly argued this, and I think that this is another point of contact with the richness of Hinton's text. In The Racial Contract, Mills argues that we are caught within a racial contract. He quote, "One has an agreement to misinterpret the world. This misinterpretation is in effect argued for forcefully as reality when it really produces a loss of a grip on reality." Mills writes that it produces, quote, "the ironic outcome that whites in general will be unable to understand the world they themselves have made," end quote. And instead, they will insist upon the truth of, quote, "white mythologies, invented Orients, invented Africas, invented Americas, with corresponding fabricated populations, countries that never were, inhabited by people who never were, Calibans and Tontos, Man Fridays and Sambas, but who attain a virtual reality through their existence in travelers' tales, folk myth, popular and highbrow fiction, colonial reports, scholarly theory, Hollywood cinema, living in the white imagination and determinately imposed on their alarmed real-life counterparts," end quote. Without this, the world in which our thinking and acting, our community, and how we listen to one another and what we fear from one another is already broken and welded to the unreal. This is illustrated in motion in our contemporary world, and no more around monuments of racial terror like the monument of Robert E. Lee. Lee is particularly interesting in this regard, not only because of the way this image evokes the Confederacy, but also in how this image has been taken up as a symbol of Jim Crow, of the entirety of anti-Black practices, including lynching. He is a symbol of a system he never fought for and had no connection to, a symbol of anti-Black violence entangled with a white identity for which what he fought for was antithetical to that very white identity. As Du Bois argues in Black Reconstruction, the white identity fought for was the whiteness of the aristocrat and the planter, etc. It was not the poor whites who replaced that class after the Civil War. And yet the symbol is fluid, even in its problematic history, even in what it fails to articulate. Robert E. Lee is a symbol of white supremacy because he is a symbol of the legitimation of anti-Black state violence. And as a symbol, this this all succeeds because it fails to say what it means. How am I doing on time?
I think probably we should wrap it up a bit, or if you're nearing the end, so that we have time for Cathy and a little bit of time left also for Alex to respond.
Yes.
So I think maybe a few minutes would be okay.
Right, good.
Okay, thank you. But it's really great. Thank you so much. All excellent.
So I think that one of the things that I want to get at is the way in which this separate discourse also needs to be brought up front. 1 second. So along with Mills, James, and Hinton, I think language matters, and I want to start to think, I want to suggest that we should start to think with this text along these lines. The language of white supremacy distills and frames an important and under-theorized locus of political violence. It calls for this violence. However, I wonder if the language and framework also obscures this violence. It makes it particular and often emphasizes its illogic, its epistemic ignorance. White supremacist violence is racist, but it is particular to white supremacist subculture and white supremacist logic, which is, as Hinton puts it, a logic of genocide. So I guess one of the questions that I'm raising here is, how much can we think about white supremacists, the sort of rise of white supremacist logic, the way in which it is dispersed, but also it seems to me that we need to also think about white supremacist logic and its relationship to genocide within the way in which there is another sort of logic at play, which is its anti-Blackness. And I think that also, so the 2 points I kind of want to emphasize here is, one, the language that we're given is a language that doesn't exactly allow us to talk directly about racist violence as genocidal violence. The other, I think, is that there's a worry that by focusing on white supremacy, everything else starts to get reduced to effects of white supremacy, rather than seeing these as interlaced histories. We could tell, I think that we could tell the same history of white supremacy that Hinton is telling us, but also focus on anti-Black structures of violence as well. I don't assume that this is something that Hinton has overlooked, because he does talk about We Charge Genocide. That takes up a big portion of the last part of the book. So this is much more of an invitation to talk more about the We Charge Genocide and sort of thinking about the differences between a genealogy of white terror and a genealogy of anti-Black violence. I'll just conclude with this last paragraph here. Can we understand our contemporary moment without understanding the political organization of violence against Black and Indigenous populations? Without this framework, Mills and Hinton both suggest that we cannot. And yet, what we are to understand, eliminate, or start to think, question, and critique together remains obscure. I think the answer to all of this lies in the relation of the analysis of 1488 and white genocide to the discussion of the We Charge Genocide petition. The petition offers an analysis of a contemporary state anti-Black violence. But the one thing I want to point out here is that the weirdness of this text is that whereas Lemkin's analysis talked about violences that had more or less been closed off, he talks historically about genocide. The We Charge Genocide petition situates genocide that's unfolding. So even as it's trying to figure out how to talk about state violence, it's also trying to figure out how to talk about a violence that's continually unfolding, and to get within the context of a language that's not equipped to address that. I think that, I wonder what Professor Hinton's thoughts on this are, but I think that one of the ways that we can use the We Charge Genocide petition now is to not just trace the pattern of anti-Black violence in its roots in the United States, but to start to think about what it means to be a post-genocide society, a society not where genocide has ended, but a society that has so fully embraced its former genocidal moments, that its genocide is just as natural as thinking and as our language. So I want us to. So I'm curious about how Professor Hinton's text might think about the We Charge Genocide in this sort of in this sense of post genocide, and how that relates to critique and the challenges that we face in terms of both thinking and thinking together and trying to address this together as a form of emancipation. I'll just end with the idea that I think what comes out of this strongly is that that prevention starts with thinking together. And so I'll just suggest that thinking together starts with us clarifying exactly the meanings of our terms.
Excellent. Thank you so much for these really thoughtful and interesting, provocative comments. We'll look forward to Alex responding. I think in the interest of time, the best way to move forward would be to have Cathy share her comments, and then we'll give Alex the final word as we move on through. Thank you so much.
Hi, so everybody, I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, my internet was having so many issues, it required its own subscription, which is why I kept kind of going in and out. So I apologize. But I'm going to limit my comments to around 7 to 8 minutes so that we have time for Alex to respond and also Q&A. Is that okay, Victoria? Does that sound like a good plan? I'm hoping so. So I wanted to.
I thought I had my volume on. Yes, that's fine. Thank you so much. Perfect.
Yeah. So, but I wanted to first acknowledge how humbled and honored I am to be part of this. Alex's work on Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge had a profound impact on my own scholarship. So I am actually now at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm doing this Zoom call from Austin, and I'll kind of go into that. And I am a professor of English and Asian American Studies there. And Victoria, I've been such a super fan of your work, particularly as it pertains to Guatemala and really expanding genocide studies away from just a European mode of thinking. And please don't worry about mispronouncing my name. It's Tiny Bottles of Schlund. That's the mnemonic device, but who knows what Schlund is. And it's okay, because even my family members, my in-laws mispronounce my name. So all good.
Okay, so just for the record, can you just say your full name and I will pronounce it correctly in the future and wow people?
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, Cathy Schlund-Vials.
Okay.
But please, Victoria, like I think that, you know, we are talking about genocide, authoritarianism, etc. But let's just be clear. My colleagues call me Schlund-Vials, so it's good. Like it's all good. But the most important part of where I was going with that is, Victoria, I've really appreciated your work. And last but certainly not least, it's kind of a hard act to follow, Al, and the work that you've done recently with regard to cultural memory and diaspora has been, you know, really kind of foundational. So thank you. I wanted to actually begin with a keyword, if I can go in that direction. And one of the most striking things about Alex's project, and in particular, It Can Happen Here, is that it recalibrates discussions of authoritarianism, human rights violation, white supremacy, and genocide, which is always haunting this text. The recalibration actually involves a turn to the mundane. And I think that that is very significant. So the definition of the mundane, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, and I am in English, is that it is so the mundane as a noun can refer to lacking interest or excitement, dull, or it can refer to the earthly world rather than a heavenly or spiritual one. And the reason why I want to focus on the mundane is that all too often accounts of authoritarianism and histories of genocide are situated as an exceptionalist, out there, and rare occurrence. And as Alex's project brings to the fore, with its emphases on structure, its emphases away from individualized accounts or culpability, is that the mundane, more often than not, is what we should pay attention to. Sinclair Lewis and It Can Happen Here tried to do in the 1930s. This issue about the mundane or the unexceptional is something that actually brings us back, perhaps inadvertently, to World War II and Frank Capra's Why We Fight, which was a very successful 7 documentary film series about the fight against fascism in the United States, and is actually credited with galvanizing the war effort in the United States and moving the United States away from an isolationist position more into an internationalist collaborative position. But what is really striking with regard to Capra, the director of this series, is that when he was assigned the project of creating a cinematic kind of call to arms, his first task was to view Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which he characterized as, quote, a terrifying motion picture and an ominous prelude to Hitler's Holocaust of hate. But what struck him most was the film's impact, though it fired, quote, though it fired no gun, dropped no bombs, as a psychological weapon aimed at destroying the will to resist, it was just as lethal. And I think that Alex's forays into Trump's campaign speeches, Charlottesville, these kind of for lack of a better term, like vignettes involving haters, quote unquote, or white supremacists, is that you realize that you don't necessarily need overt violence to actually achieve the goal of authoritarianism. And this was something that was at the forefront of Capra's mind when he completed the series, which included what was happening abroad in Asia, Europe, Russia, and he brings the fight back home. But one of the emphases, time and again, in Why We Fight is this move from isolationism into a more international sensibility, this move away from self-interest into more human rights interest and universal humanity. So I think that in many ways, what Alex's book does and does quite well is actually provide a template through which we can do this type of work pedagogically, but also to counter what is really difficult to unpack, which is the mundane. I want to actually kind of bring that issue of the mundane into my own personal experience, because I'm very self-absorbed. I apologize. And I'm going to conclude in about 2 minutes, just to kind of give a sense. But, being back in Austin, and I am from Austin, I grew up in Austin. Being back in Austin has made me kind of see how I have, for most of my academic career, moved away from the mundane, and I've really focused on exceptional moments of violence. So as an Asian Americanist, when I teach Asian American history, I oftentimes will talk about exclusion acts. I will talk about internment. I will talk about the case against Vincent Chin, where he was brutally murdered as for, a very high profile hate crime. And I create for my students a sense that these are exceptions to the rule of US ideology, as opposed to the rule of US ideology. And I realized after reading through Alex's project that this contributes to a strategic amnesia with regard to the past. And that strategic amnesia is something that I'm really concerned about and has really kind of occupied a lot of my thinking because of two individuals who I hope I don't resemble in any way, shape, or form, but we do have some common background. So the first is Marjorie Taylor Greene. The second is Alex Jones. Marjorie Taylor Greene was born in 1974, as was Alex Jones, as was I. Alex Jones actually is from Austin and went to Anderson High School and I went to high school in Austin. I went to Albert Sidney Johnston High School, which was named after a Confederate general. But Anderson High School, where Alex Jones went, was actually a high school that was geared towards desegregation, primarily served African-American students up until 1971, and then became a predominantly white school. And the school that I went to, bearing the Confederate general's name, was a predominantly Black and Latino school, 85%, in the poorest part of Austin. So I looked at Marjorie Taylor Greene and Alex Jones, and I kind of think, well, what was the deciding factor? Why are they like them, and why am I like me? Because politically speaking, I'm very to the left of these individuals, but also in terms of an education, I don't have the same relationship to US exceptionalism. I do not have the same relationship to white supremacy. And it's not just my location as a person of color. And one of the things that I think that Alex's project brings to the fore is an opportunity to not so much diagnose the whys, but to actually revisit the how. How do people get to the point when that they start fires? And I think that the question of what makes a man start fires is fascinating. But what I'm really struck by in Alex's project is the articulation of what makes a man not start fires. If we think of, kind of white supremacy, and isolationism as natural, how can we denaturalize that and make more kind of mundane this issue of not starting fires? So I think that, I'm not as articulate as I would have liked to have been, but I think that, what Alex had as a project was quite daunting. And I kind of want to end on a more, perhaps like an observation that will make sense. In many ways, Alex's career, particularly with regard to genocide analysis, anthropological inquiry, is one that is well suited to the moment. But the problem we have now is the problem that's akin to somebody who is a smallpox expert and the pandemic has already occurred. So I think that what Alex does quite eloquently and provocatively is not only highlight what has come before and underscore what we're presently facing, but actually offer ways and techniques to kind of move forward so that we can actually continue to deconstruct the mundane. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cathy. Alex, why don't you take a few moments to respond to the commentators, and then we can open it up for general questions. If anyone listening, participating has a question, you can post it in the chat. But for now, Alex, why don't you respond, please? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, what a fantastic set of commentaries and so much to think about. And again, I just want to reiterate how much, both their scholarship has meant to me and, as well as with Victoria. And I can't imagine better people to be engaging in this discussion. I'm really honored that the three of you have participated in this. And as expected, the questions themselves have raised more profound questions and ones that certainly are beyond the amount of time we have left to discuss. But the sort of connection, I was thinking of the mundane, and then We Charge Genocide, and there's a bit of backstory on We Charge Genocide. Professor Frankowski knows this, but we've had a discussion going on, and I published a couple of pieces. One came out in Politico that sort of revisits We Charge Genocide. And again, I'm not sure everyone knows the petition. Hopefully they do. It was brought by Paul Robeson, William Patterson, Du Bois, different people, and charging the US with genocide in 1951, shortly after the convention was promulgated. And it was because they were communist, most of them, or had communist sympathies, and the sort of coordinating organization was communist. It was, it was dismissed. It was in the middle of the Cold War. So I had, I brought this up, and the reason it sort of connects this, first, I think that Professor Frankowski is exactly right. That petition, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of grappling with the questions that it posed and the challenges that it posed at that moment in time that continue to reverberate into the present. And I think the post-genocide comment is exactly right. So I wrote a second piece that actually just came out today on Opinio Juris that responded to someone who said, well, you can't find special intent. And just to be fair, the scholar, Kevin Heller, is a great scholar, and he agreed with much of the analysis in the Politico piece. And then I wrote a response to him, sort of, showing in some sense, within a court of law, special intent is there. And certainly, I think you can make a case for special intent, but that's not the question, right? And the question itself frames the discourse. And going back to, sort of the language limitations that Professor Frankowski was talking about, it doesn't fit within those discourses, and the discourses are purposely created to exclude conversation about that topic. So again, in terms of language, the second part of the title is Black Genocide and the Limits of Law for that very reason. But I think post-genocide is sort of the next point, because I was dealing up through Jim Crow and those and sort of looking ahead. But the post-genocide question is, I think, exactly the next question that sort of needs to be addressed. But the reason it links back to the mundane, I just wanted, which is a great frame. Essentially, both of you took up language terms, severance, for example. The reason that how it links in is actually what was going on in the US at that time was completely mundane, most of it. There was the spectacular lynchings that sometimes made it into the headlines, but often didn't, because they were commonplace. They were taken for granted. And the Opinio Juris piece actually begins with Hannah Arendt writing to Jaspers saying, oh, the Nazi atrocities explode the limits of law, whereas the day before, John Jones, a Black former Army corporal, had been lynched. And, I won't tell you the details. It was in the backstory of the Times. It was mundane, right? And We Charge Genocide goes into all sorts of other things that were, quote unquote, mundane and horrific. And that, even though, again, don't have time to get into here, at least from my perspective, clearly warrant and call for the term genocide, even if maybe within the limits of special intent, and there are different forms of intent, they don't go. So, it's sort of interesting that, those two comments that you both brought up synergize around this issue. And maybe it's just because I've been writing about it and thinking about it a lot the last week and a half that I'm sort of foregrounding it. But absolutely, that was one of the challenges of writing the book, going back to the mundane, is we're used to, as scholars, stepping back and having the benefit, right, of looking sort of backwards. It's like the angel of history, maybe, right? And don't do so well with what's currently going on in time, in the moment. And especially since publications also in academia are structured in such a way that they come out after long periods of time. Even my book, I wanted it to come out before the election, and it took until June 2021. They got a PDF version out a little bit before that. so we're not, I think there's strides that have been being made, but it's a challenge, and it's certainly a challenge that, as both of you pointed out, I was grappling with, and part of it was by setting things in real time as things were going on. I don't want to take up too much time just in terms of, what makes, quote unquote, what makes a man not start fires. That sort of gets back to the Adorno, I think, is their critical self-consciousness is one of the things, in the place of education. So maybe I'll stop there with these great commentaries, because, if anyone has a couple more questions, maybe it's nice to end with Adorno again, with critical self-reflection. I should just note one last thing. There is a teacher's guide. I would probably do it differently, now you keep changing and updating on the NYU website. If anybody's interested in teaching it, there is a teacher's guide with links and some questions and different things that's available. So I'll stop there. I think really with the comments that they're the beginning of a conversation, and conversations I've had with all three of you. And again, thank you all for your comments and for taking the time from your busy schedules to do this. And thanks again to Tim and Suzanne for hosting this great forum of book launches.
Thank you so much, Alex. We still have a few minutes left. I have a few comments, but I don't want to take over. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask, or any additional comments they would like to share? Or Al or Cathy, do you have anything you would like to respond back to Alex? No, yes, no, maybe so. Okay, well, I want to actually go to a personal point that Al actually made me think of, that you took me back to when you were talking about when Trump was elected. The day that Trump was elected, in New York City, we have this crazy process for schools for our kids. And my daughter had an interview for middle school. It's insane, but that's the way our system works. And that morning, I went to bed thinking that Hillary Clinton had won, and woke up to discover that Trump was our president, and seeing that red map, which still gives me goosebumps when I remember it. And so when you shared that with me, or with us, that was one of the things that I was remembering. And so my daughter was going to interview for middle school. So was like, what, 12? I guess 12 at the time. And so there she is. And I have to tell her, she thinks that Hillary Clinton, we have our first woman president. I have to tell her that Donald Trump won. And she just begins to sob and cry. And I have to jolly her out of the apartment into this miserable, cold, gray New York day. It was like one of those 1950s noir images of New York. And then everyone here, because we did all vote for Clinton, very few of us voted for Trump, everyone was just kind of closed in their bodies in the cold with their umbrella and just looking meh. And we got to the school, and there was my daughter, just like, she looked like the most miserable, unhappy child, because Trump had just been elected. And I was also remembering being with my students at Lehman College, who, we serve the Bronx, which is the highest concentration of urban poverty in the country. We're a Hispanic serving college. Our student body population is maybe 5% Anglo. That would be my estimation. In any case, I had class the day that Obama was elected, the morning that we woke up. And in that class, all my students were crying. We cried together. And one of my students said, today's the best day of my life, because I woke up my son, who's 8 years old, and I said, you can be president because Barack Obama just got elected. And I still get emotional remembering that. And I think it's really important for us to remember the possibilities for emancipation. And I think that's a really good statement that you made in your comments, Al, about Alex's work, because I think it reminds us of the struggles that we have and the possibilities as well. And when Cathy is talking about the mundane, I was thinking, when in my work in Guatemala, and I know also in Alex's work in Cambodia, and the work of so many others who work in places maybe a little bit off the Euro map, one of the things that I know we all see is that peacemaking doesn't happen when the peace accords are signed. Peacemaking is happening in the midst of violence. Peacemaking is happening when people are living under army control, paramilitary control, guerrilla control, gang control. Peacemaking is happening in communities and neighborhoods before there's any institutionalization of that. And in a certain way, I think Alex's book is showing this reverse process of the same thing, right? It's like this response in the white supremacy movement. But I think that we can find places for emancipation in the struggle that's ongoing, because it isn't something that's new. It's grounded in our history, it's grounded in structure, and it's grounded in a system that presents itself as being democratic, but is almost always exclusionary. You get to participate, but, right? You get to participate, but. And so I just wanted to share those thoughts. I think it's an amazing book, and I look forward to teaching it. Al or Cathy, did you want to make a closing comment, or Timothy or Suzanne? Anyone? No? Yes, Cathy.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry I keep going in and out, but you know, I have to say that one of the it's actually kind of frightening how relevant Alex's project remains. And one of the things that really struck me about just the way that it's constructed, and I think this is very important, is that it actually militates against one of the biggest issues we face in academia, which is accessibility. And I know that what is really quite striking about the project is that it makes a complicated argument, but does so in a way that actually is quite public facing. And these are, you know, so the, you know, in terms of the structure of the book, it's, you know, it's a brilliant argument, but I think that the writing is also such that it provides a template for all of us. And or perhaps like for me, because my writing resembles stereo hookup instructions. So, but you know, I think that in moving forward, we who do this work should take seriously what Alex has done in reframing the arguments in a way that are accessible, public facing, and impactful.
I would just follow up on that point too, that I think that if we sort of think about the sort of the way in which the various white supremacist movements have sought to expand by signaling where folks with particular sympathies and anxieties, giving them a framework to articulate themselves there. But I think that Hinton's work does exactly the reverse of that, of signaling to other folks who are within academia and outside of academia, but have a real need. And I see this in my students, right? That they have a real need to articulate how can they not accept the world that they have been, the normative structures of the world that they have been given. And I think that this book does an amazing job of showing why genocidal frameworks are necessary for us to start to even think about the types of violences that I think that many of our young folks want to be a part of a movement that says that's not going to be part of the next generation of this world, right? Now, whether they can do that or not, the fact that they're asking those questions is the really important thing, and being able to articulate that, I think, is wonderful, is where that begins. And this book does a wonderful job of signaling how you go about drawing together those threads.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Alex, would you like to take a last word? Then we'll close.
I don't want to give others the last word, but I want to make one point of correction with Cathy. She's a great writer, very clear writer. So that's anyways, you're a fantastic writer. So anyways, but the point about writing is, I completely agree with, and it's something, even with my next book, Anthropological Witness, something I've been really concerned with is trying to find new ways to write that can engage audiences that are as clear as possible, but yet maintain nuance and hopefully a degree of sophistication in the argument. And it's something, and I talk about this with my students. I was trained to be a bad writer. I was, you go and you look, I was trained to be a bad writer and to use words that most people can't understand. So the way I think about it now sometimes is, if I'm having a conversation with a non-academic relative, which is obviously most of the relatives, can I have that sort of conversation, right? Because if I start talking in the stuff I was trained, the language I was trained to use, nobody will have any idea what I'm talking about. I know everyone's had this experience. And so every time I write now, that's what I think about. I want to be talking to my relative or friend, someone who's not in academia. And if I can't present the ideas in that manner, then I'm failing, because it's quite possible. And I'll, maybe to loop back to Adorno, Education After Auschwitz was given on public radio, right? And of course, it is still a difficult text, but it was given on public radio. And so that, at least for me, and thank you for picking up on that, has been important to sort of work on in all my recent projects.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a beautiful book, very, very powerful, and an honor to moderate this panel, to share ideas and hear ideas of colleagues. Thank you so much, Timothy and Suzanne, for organizing this amazing event. I hope that everyone has gotten a lot out of it. There are lots of nice chat notes coming in saying, thank you, I have to run. Looking forward to reading the book. So wonderful to see everyone. Stay safe, stay warm, be well, and thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much, everyone.